Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. Today's show focuses on the legacy of Jeff Sauer, the longtime coach of the Wisconsin Badgers hockey team. He won 2 national championships at Wisconsin and collected 655 wins in 31 years of NCAA Division I coaching. But Sauer was also remembered for coaching hearing-impaired and Paralympic athletes. He coached the U.S. national sled hockey team to a gold medal in 2014 in Sochi at the Paralympic Games. Sauer was preparing to coach the team again in the 2018 Paralympic Games at the time of his death in February 2017. Following his passing, his friends and family came together to start the Coach Sauer Foundation to carry on the coach's hockey and humanitarian legacy, using the game of hockey to help others. I talk with his longtime friend, hockey broadcaster, and president of the foundation, Bill Brophy. Brophy was the sports editor of the Wisconsin State Journal for much of Jeff Sauer's tenure at Wisconsin. I asked Brophy to reflect on Sauer's career and commitment to helping others through hockey. I know the Coach Sauer Foundation is new. You had a big sold-out banquet last fall. Where do you hope to make a difference with the foundation?
Well, we started the foundation last November, technically, with a dinner in Madison, which was pretty successful. Yeah, we had Tony Granato speak to a sold-out crowd at Blackhawk, and we had the U.S. Paralympic team, the sled hockey team, which will represent the U.S. and in Korea at the Paralympics here starts March 9th. It's Jeff's old team and Mark Johnson there. He had a lot of old hockey people, and it was a great success. We got a lot of cooperation from hockey people around the country in a silent auction. I think we had 12, 14 NHL jerseys, and we had great response from all his people that he came in contact with. So that was a success, and people like myself and the family and said we ought to do something to keep Jeff's legacy alive. The fact that he, was involved in more than just UW hockey. I mean, he's the winningest coach in the history of University of Wisconsin's athletic department, among the all-time winningest coaches in college hockey. But he did so much more of a humanitarian type stuff. For the last 40 years, he was involved with the Stan McKeon, now the Tony Granato School in Chicago, which trains and runs clinics for the hearing impaired hockey players in the Chicagoland area. It's become a national deal, and Jeff coached in the U.S. team in the Deaf Olympics over time, and he also, since returning at the UW, was the head coach for the U.S. sled hockey team. And at the World Tournament, where they won a national championship, and the defending gold medalist, they won a gold medal at Sochi, Russia in 2014. So he did so many other things. I mean, he worked at the WIA tournament. He was a proponent of high school hockey, did television broadcasts with me and Bob Radovich. He ran a hockey clinic the last 4 or 5 years of his life on the morning of the championship game for youth hockey players. That was his idea, and he got coaches and ex-players to serve as counselors at that. So, I mean, he was such an ambassador of the game that we want to keep his legacy alive, and thus we started the foundation, which hopes to do good things to help people, not only in hockey, but just do good things. But its primary focus is hockey.
Do you remember the first time you met Jeff Sauer, and then how did you kind of become friends with him over time?
Well, I started a long time ago, back in the mid-'70s. My first job out of college was in Duluth, Minnesota, as a young know-it-all writer for the Duluth News Tribune, and part of my job was to cover high school hockey. Part of it was to cover Minnesota Duluth, college hockey. So I think the first time I saw Jeff was hardly a memorable experience. Just like a lot of college coaches, he was recruiting the Iron Range area, which is the area I covered for the Duluth paper. They turned out a lot of great players there. Billy Baker went on to play for the U.S. Olympic team, along with Phil Verkoten, was on that 1980 team. It was the golden days of Iron Range hockey. So every college coach and at least in the western part of the U.S., came up to scout players, and Jeff was one of them. So, in passing, I think I got to know him. The first time I really remember him is he was at a Blue Line luncheon in Duluth, which, basically is a lunch to boosters of the program attend, and the local hockey coach spoke, and the visiting coach spoke, and in this case it was Jeff. And he took umbrage at something the smart aleck young writer had composed for the morning paper. And so he spent about 5 minutes ripping me. So I went up to him afterwards, and because that was Jeff, he didn't have any hard feelings. I don't think he was too crazy about anything I wrote, but he was more than happy to talk about it. But that's really the first interaction I remember, and then dealing with him after the game and thereafter. And I certainly saw him at various tournaments throughout the country thereafter, shared a few Bud Lights in his case, Miller Lite in my case, and he certainly had an affinity for pizza as well. So over time, I learned that the CC coach was a good guy, and then when he took the job in Madison in '82, we did have a bit of a relationship. At least we knew one another. So, but the first time I remember him was he basically ripped me for doing my job back in the young '70s, but I was probably not as mature as I am now.
That's great. You mentioned all this stuff that he did after he was done coaching at Wisconsin, helping out with the hearing impaired and the disabled with sled hockey. Do you know how he first got involved in all of that stuff?
I'm not sure how he started up in Chicago, to be honest with you. His wife is from the Chicago area, so he'd travel down there, and I think because of that, he met a lot of members of the Chicago Blackhawks alumni group, and I think that's how he got mixed up with Makita and those folks. And I mean, just because he's a generous guy, I'm assuming that. But I don't really know the story. I know they trained traditionally in the Chicago area, and he started doing camps every year. And as he grew in stature in the college game, and the organization grew in the Chicago area, I know Jeff got more and more of his colleagues involved to help out in the summer in campers. But I don't know the origins of how he got started there. As far as how he got involved with the sled hockey, they came to him. USA Hockey came to him after he retired at the UW, and he didn't think that was going to work out real well. He wasn't real familiar with sled hockey, and so they had to do a bit of a sell job just because he was unfamiliar with the game. And but he went, observed, talked to the guys, and the guys kind of did the recruiting job because Jeff was an old Army guy, and he always had a respect for military guys. And then I think it's an original team that he inherited had 7 Purple Hearts. So they had a lot of, I mean, they all have such compelling stories. Some of them were born with a disability, but a lot of those guys were military guys that lost legs, and he was just moved by their humility, moved by their stories, moved by the goodness in their hearts. So it didn't take those guys long to convince him to do it. And he went in there and treated them all like hockey players, didn't treat them like guys that had disabilities. He used the same tactics, the same motivational devices he used when he was coaching the Badgers in Colorado College and at world tournaments. And I think they respected that he treated them as players, and there was some mutual respect there off the top, and he loved those guys at the end, and he obviously had great success with them on the ice.
Yeah, 2 gold medals. Did he ever reflect on that with you about winning and that success at the Paralympics? What did he make of that success?
Oh, he loved it. He told me, and we were pretty good friends. He told me that meant as much to him as anything he'd have done in hockey. The gold medal they won in Sochi, they really had a tight bond, he and that team, and well, after he took over the team, just it coincided with pretty much, I think, the Wounded Warrior appreciation that's going on in this country right now as more and more of those guys come back from fighting for our country overseas. The country's kind of embraced them in a way they didn't with Vietnam veterans. I mean, Jeff appreciated that all along, but PBS did a documentary, Ice Warriors, it's called. It's still available. It's not like I'm pitching it, but it is available online, and it's very compelling. PBS did a great job. It's about a 45-minute documentary that followed their team around for a year prior to Sochi. But it tells the stories of all those guys in their own words, and in the words of Coach Sauer as well. But if you really want to get a pretty good idea of how tight those guys were as a team and the respect that Jeff had for the players and vice versa, that documentary does a pretty good job of summing it up. But those guys are inspiring fellows with such great attitudes toward life, and they love to play the game. And so, as I say, he told me winning over in Sochi was about as big a thing as he had ever done in hockey, and that was real meaningful for him. And I know he was looking forward to going to Korea here at the Paralympics in 2018, so it's unfortunate he didn't get an opportunity to coach that team.
You were working at the State Journal in his heyday at Wisconsin, so I'm sure you got to observe and interview him during that time. What do you think made him such a good coach?
He gave his players free reign. He let them grow as college kids. I mean, he knew the game. He could X and O's with you. But basically, you wanted hockey players to be creative and utilize their strengths at what they did well. If they're goal scorers, well, there you let those guys go. But I mean, he let players grow up. I mean, I think he let the team kind of mold the identity, and he did that with a master plan in mind. I mean, you talk about the 83 team, and they talk about a players-only meeting in January that turned their season around. I think they only lost one game down the stretch after the players got together and decided really what their role ought to be. And when he won in 90, they talk about how the players took over the team, or at least that's what the autopsies of those seasons showed. Well, I think that was kind of part of Jeff's genius, to let the players figure out that what he was suggesting to them, their roles on the team ought to be the way that things went, and it took a while for the players to identify that. But you talk to a lot of his players now. In fact, Mark Strobel, one of his former captains, and now the associate head coach for Tony Granato at Wisconsin, he spoke the other night at a dinner before the state high school tournament, and Strobel said just that the genius of Jeff was you didn't appreciate him until you were done playing, and then you reflect back on what happened and how guys always came together. But he didn't do it with harsh rules or whatever. He let them figure it out for themselves as they matured as human beings. And I think all his ex-players, or at least the majority of them, I don't know if he was that big a genius, but the majority of his players came to reflect back and respect Jeff more after they were done playing than when they did play for him.
For people who weren't around in like the 80s, or like myself, who weren't like necessarily conscious in the 80s, they were a kid or growing up in that period. Can you kind of explain how big of a deal Wisconsin hockey was in the 80s and the early 90s?
Well, it was the only sport that won. I mean, before Barry Alvarez showed football, didn't have much success. To be fair, Dave McClain had some pretty good teams in the early 80s, but the bowl system was different. So not everybody went to the bowl game like the silly system there is now. So even though he had some 8-win teams, their season ended at Thanksgiving. In basketball, you had the faithful 5,000, as they were known, the 5,000 fans who would show up to watch 500 or sub 500 teams play basketball every year at the Fieldhouse, which is a quaint tradition-filled building, but it's not as nice as going to the Kohl Center currently. And I remember I was a sports editor at the paper at the time when the Badgers qualified for the NIT, which it was the first postseason invitation since they won a national championship back in the 40s. So you could see it was there was a long stretch to where there wasn't a lot of basketball success. NIT was a big deal, so there was no basketball success, there was no football success, and the hockey team was good every year. First under Bob Johnson, who did a great job of selling the program to an audience that couldn't tell a blue line from a clothesline and thought the only use of ice was to put your beer in. But he educated them, and he won. And they won in 73 in Boston. It was a dramatic game on TV. A guy named Dean Talipus, who went on to play in the NHL, got the game-winning goal. They won again in 77 with a great team with included Mike Eaves and Mark Johnson. That team scored one out every 3 times in the power play. They were fun as heck to watch, scored a lot of goals. but they had success, and that success carried it over into the 80s, and then Bob left to go on to pro hockey, won another title in 81. Sauer came along in 83. He won his first year. I mean, again, you had great players. You had Chris Chelios, who may be the best American-born hockey player ever played here. He continued that success with guys that went on to play in the NHL in the 80s. Tony Granato showed up. Gary Suter was here. I mean, the list is so darn long. And he's always had good goaltenders that went on to play in the NHL. Curtis Joseph and Jim Carey. But anyway, they won. They were the only winner in the 80s, so you could plan your spring break, not necessarily to South Padre Island or to Florida or to Phoenix, but you could go with your fellow Badger fans to the national tournament in hockey every year, or at least many years. Go have a good time, and they won. And that's the best marketing device in college hockey is winning. And they did that consistently back under Badger Bob and continued on under Jeff Sauer. So the fans in town embraced them, and they had a good time, and the team won.
And I hear there was a pretty good beer garden at the Coliseum as well.
I've heard the same thing. I was a hardworking young hockey writer then who had to refrain from going to the beer garden between periods, but there certainly were a lot of people that did. No, it was a good time. It was a social place to be in Madison. Again, the team won. It was a tough ticket. It was and a lot of fun and reasonably priced beer where you'd run into your friends 20 times a year on weekends when it was cold outside. So go to the fish fry, go to the Badger game, watch the first period, go to the beer garden. A lot of people I hear stayed down there for the second period of the beer garden and the second intermission, and they'd come back in the third when a lot of times the Badgers either rallied or ahead, and everybody left happy and with a couple beers in them.
And you mentioned some of the players that came through the program during those years. I'm kind of curious, like, Jeff Sauer's relationship with those players during that time, like, how did he coach them any different than any of the other players on his team? I mean, how did he approach some of those stars as a coach?
Well, again, he was hardly a taskmaster. He let guys play. But, I mean, I think it's fair to say, as all veteran coaches would tell you when they're done, if you get good players, you're a lot better coach. And he had a good recruiter in Mike Kemp to bring in good players for him. And they did. They recruited nationally, and we even went internationally. They brought in Elvis Katlaps from Latvia, who didn't pan out as well as they thought. But at the time, it was a big deal to bring in a player from Latvia. Now it happens quite a bit as the game's more global. But he knew who the best players were in North America, and he and Kemper would go get them. I mean, Mike could identify them and be the first contact, and then Jeff was the closer in recruiting. But, you know, if you had guys that could skate, he utilized them. If you had guys that could shoot it, you'd set up your power play for them. And then Chelios and Bruce Driver were great defensemen. I mean, he just had a lot of players, and he benefited in the later years from sons of former Badgers. Danny Heatley's dad, Murray, played here in the mid-'70s. Danny Heatley was as good a recruit as they ever brought in here because everybody in Canada knew him, but he chose to play college hockey, and he chose to play it here, and he came in and scored 28 goals his first year and played with Steve Reinpeck the second year when the Badgers won 30 games and had the best team in the country. They didn't get to go to the NCAA tournament that year, but that was a fun team to watch, and it was disappointing, I know, to Coach Sauer when he didn't win 2000, when the year when I think he felt with Heatley and Reinprecht he had the best players in the country.
Did he maintain relationships with a lot of these players after they were done at the program?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, I got to travel a lot with him, but wherever you'd go, I mean, he was a bigger deal outside of the 608 area code than he was in town. I mean, he certainly had his detractors. People were frustrated by his team's power plays over many years. It took him a while to develop, and the Bluebirds had come out. So over time, in this talk show culture we have, I think, the critics became more apparent. So I mean, although he's certainly gaining a lot of attention here in depth, Jeff certainly had people that were happy to see him go. but as far as his players, I think they've always recognized him for being a good guy. That guy they could talk to. They went to him for advice, both when he played and when they were done. I mean, poor Danny Healy is one of the premier players in the world and an MVP in the NHL, but he also had some problems with a drunk driving case where his roommate in Atlanta got killed, and it was a story that's rightly so was a terrible one and got a lot of publicity both in Canada and the Atlantic area. And Healy sought Jeff out in that really traumatic time of his life for advice. I think he served as a character witness in the legal proceedings. But there's an extreme example. A lot of guys when we travel, would come up to him and be happy to see him. But a lot of them called in times of trouble looking for advice or just looking for career advice. So he, again, his door was always open as a player, and because he was such an easygoing guy who I think they learned to respect more after they left, he had good relationships with the majority of his players. He was certainly a player's coach. I think that would be the label he'd be put on him.
Were you around for the water bottle game, the infamous water bottle brawl?
I was. Jeff wasn't. That happened under Badger Bob's watch.
Well, I guess I got to ask, independent of any talk about Jeff, I have to ask you about that. Can you tell me about it a little bit?
Well, different times, to be sure. I mean, in the college hockey game, it was in 1982. Bob Johnson was the coach. They were playing North Dakota at the Coliseum. It was, there was the two preeminent programs of the time, and probably two of the best programs ever. And they both had a lot of elite players on their respective rosters, many of whom had known one another from their days, either as high school players in Minnesota or junior players in this case in British Columbia. And, again, it was a big deal when North Dakota and Wisconsin had played in front of the beard-up crowd at the Coliseum or in front of the teetotalers, I'm sure, in North Dakota. No, they get after it pretty good up there before the games as well. And anyway, this latest episode, or the episode of the water bottle game, was in Madison, and it would be a real big deal if it happened now. Sports Center would be playing this, the highlights, and probably calling for the end of college hockey because it was. What happened was, again, heated game, two good teams, title on the line. North Dakota went on to beat Wisconsin in the title game in '82 that year, but. North Dakota had great players. James Patrick went on to a long career. I think they had 12 NHLers or future NHLers on their roster. The Badgers had another dozen. Some really premier players. And in that same water bottle game, Chris Chelios, a future Hall of Famer, beat John Casey, a future NHL goaltender, with a shot from 200 feet away. But nobody remembers that. It was from one end of the ice to the other. You're just clearing the puck, sent it the length of the ice. Chelios' shot beat Casey from that far away. But all anybody remembers is in the third period, John Newberry was on the Badger bench. He was one of the premier players. He's from British Columbia. He knew Carrie Eads from North Dakota from their past days. He said something to Eads about, I believe, his girlfriend, and Eads looked at him out of the side of his eyes. Newberry squirted him with the water bottle on the ice. Eads took exception to getting doused and walked down to the Badger bench and threw a couple punches, and he was met with a couple punches from Newberry and his teammate, and it was on a full-scale bench-clearing brawl that started on the Badger bench, went out on the ice, went out into the aforementioned beer garden. Players with skates on were fighting in the beer garden in the tunnel between the two benches. And it went on for about 15 to 20 minutes. It continued to break out. The coaches tried to break it up, and players, when the order was restored, it was like a yard sale on the ice with the equipment scattered everywhere. A lot of the Badger players went around flicking gloves and other North Dakota paraphernalia into the crowd. It was quite a scene, and again, the likes of which I do feel safe in saying college hockey will never see again. I don't think today's administrators would think it was great, but the fact we're talking about the water bottle game almost 40 years later tells you it did have some impact on those that were there and those that have seen it on YouTube.
So you've been around. You've seen some things on the rinks around the country. Is that what brought you to Madison to kind of report on the big Wisconsin program at that time? Is that why you wanted to work at the State Journal?
I mean, it's certainly helped. I can't say, I didn't really care about it. It was a Badger program. I like covering college hockey. Again, my first job out of school was in Duluth. I worked there for 5 years covering the Bulldogs for 4 of them. And the editor of the State Journal came to town one year with the Badgers. He was covering the team. And in those days, you typed your story and you sent them back to the office via a portable fax machine. Well, in this case, Glenn Miller was the sports editor. His portable fax machine broke down, so I let him use mine under deadline, and he is appreciative of that. And then I guess he read the paper during his 3-day stay and thought that the subject and predicates were aligned, and my grammar was okay. So anyway, he called. He was looking for a hockey writer at the end of that season. He called and asked me to interview, and it was Madison's winters are certainly a little more mild than Duluth. And anyway, it was a good job opportunity for me, and you're covering a good team, and it really worked out well for me. I'm still here 40 years later and got to cover the Brewers for a number of years. I love baseball and got to cover the Brewers Sloan World Series team in '82. I was the beat guy there. So the combination of covering hockey in the winter and baseball in the summer was ideal for me. And again, it couldn't have worked out better.
But I got to ask you, I know you left the State Journal in the mid-'90s to take a job with the Catholic Church in Madison at the diocese. That was a time when that jump wasn't very common for a journalist to jump into something like that. What were some of the reasons you made that move?
Well, I was more than a hockey and baseball writer. I became a sports editor at the State Journal in '84. I'd done it 12 years. I had a couple of daughters, and they were growing up, and I wasn't home a lot. I mean, Barry Alvarez would get a job offer from the Miami Dolphins at dinner, and my phone would ring about how are we going to cover this. I don't want to say I got sick of it, because I really enjoyed that experience, and I think we did some good things at a time when newspapers were meaningful and had a growing circulation. We had a great bunch of folks both on our staff and the other editors I work with. So I enjoyed that position immensely. But an opportunity arose. The bishop of the diocese at the time was Bishop William Bullock, who ironically was my old religion teacher in high school back in the Twin Cities. He had just closed the seminary, Holy Name, in Madison, and they pretty much wrote a primer on what not to do as far as crisis communication. So anyway, I figured they had called and asked if I'd be interested in interviewing for the job. And I figured I'll just go in there and tell them what they did wrong and what they should be looking for, and figuring there's no way they're going to hire a guy like me. But I knew Bishop Bullock. I liked Bishop Bullock. So I went in there as a know-it-all and told them what I thought, and apparently they liked what I heard, and I was very surprised when they offered me the job. But it was a great experience, it was a roller coaster ride, to be sure, but I really enjoyed the years I worked for Bishop Bullock, and it was a really good experience, and certainly allowed to have more time with my family, and again, I worked with a lot of great people at the diocese. I mean, a lot of really good people, and it was a good experience.
And currently, you're working for the Western Collegiate Hockey Association. Do you enjoy having hockey back? I'm sure you watched while you're working at the diocese, but is it nice to have hockey and sports kind of back in your professional life over the last decade or so?
Well, I do. I mean, one of the nice things about working for Bishop Bullock is he enabled me to continue starting in 1990 or 89 in 90. I did Badger hockey on the radio. I was working at the State Journal as well. So I did color commentary on those games. And one of my concerns in taking the job at the diocese was, would I be able to continue that? I mean, I recognize it was a little awkward having the bishop's spokesman describing a 5-on-4 power play or the neutral zone trap on the weekends, but anyway, he was fine with it, and so they enabled me to get the flexibility in the job to travel. So I kept that the radio gig. I left. I gave that up after 1 year with Mike Hughes. After Jeff stepped down, 1 year with Mike Hughes was enough. I went back to pray in the chapel after that, and God told me that I should leave working with Mike Hughes. So I still had hockey in my blood, even though I was the Bishop's spokesperson. But I was very grateful that they gave me the flexibility to do that. So, but anyway, I do enjoy my current position. I left the diocese in 2006. Bishop Morlino and I didn't exactly see eye to eye, and I was fortunate enough after I left in 2006 that a friend of mine, Tim Eichhorst, was in the early days of starting a company to cover high school and college athletics, When We Are Young Productions, which has morphed into Rush Media, and Eichhorst hired me literally minutes after Bishop Morlino and I agreed that I probably shouldn't be working for him. So, but a lot of that also included working for the WCHA. I mean, it had nothing to do with working for Eichhorst. I had a PR position with the WCHA. The women's side was just starting to grow, and so I've primarily been in charge of the public relations aspect for women's hockey in the WCHA for about 10 years now. But my real job, I guess, my real job is I'm an independent contractor, but I work for Rush Media, doing broadcasting, telecasting for Rush, who does college and high school games. I do most of the state tournaments for the WIAA, and also do the College World Series every year in Appleton, the Division III version of the baseball championships for Raycom out of Kansas City. I've done that for the last 10 years. So if you got a gig, I'll come over and talk about it.
Fair enough. You brought up women's hockey. I'm just kind of curious, since that's really grown over the course of your lifetime and your familiarity with college hockey. Can you talk a little bit about the growth of women's hockey during your lifetime?
Well, I think it's still in its infancy, quite honestly. But yeah, it's grown. I mean, my daughters didn't play, and they look back now saying they wish we had it. I mean, I've heard that a lot about Title and the pre-Title IX days as well, and for a lot of sports. But college hockey is one of those. It's only been around since 1980 on the collegiate level. The high school program started taking off in Minnesota about then, and it moved westward into Wisconsin, where there's currently 29 high school programs in Wisconsin that have the sport, but a lot of those are co-op teams. I just did the state girls tournament here the last week in March, and all 4 teams in the tournament were co-ops. I mean, the one team had 8 schools in it. It took me the first period to read the names of all the competing teams in the co-op. But that's how it's growing. I mean, schools don't have 20 girls at the school playing hockey, but so they have to co-op with other schools in the region to play. But it is certainly growing. But I think history will say it's in its infancy, and it got a big boost certainly by the tenacity and the skill level exhibited when the U.S. beat Canada for the gold medal in Pyeongchang here in February. I mean that was as good a hockey game as you're gonna get. But young girls will see that and want to get into it, and if their parents have the financial wherewithal, because it is a rich kid sport, they'll play because it's fun, and girls have shown they can play the game as well as the boys. It's a more pure game without checking, although it certainly can be physical. If you watch that Canada-U.S. game, you can see that it's a physical game which allows what they call rubbing out or angling when players hit one another at an angle. But if you don't throw an elbow or you keep your stick down, or if you don't actually make a body check, that's legal. If you make a body check, that is illegal. It's a tough sport to officiate because of the nuances. But anyway, it's a more pure game with more of an emphasis on skating and stick handling and shooting. And I truly hope they don't allow body checking in the women's game. But to your question about the growth of the sport, it's pretty much been in the last 20 years. I'm in Minneapolis right now. We're about to stage our 19th final face-off with 3 of the top 7 college teams in the country. And Wisconsin sells out every game after football ends at LeBron Arena. They got a beautiful new rink that holds 2,200 people, and you can't get a ticket at January and February to watch Mark Johnson's team and They won the last 3 WCHA titles. Minnesota is been in the NCAA tournament all but 1 year of its 18-year existence. And in a program, they've got a 3,200-seat rink up here where we're going to play the championships, and we hope to fill most of that today for as I speak, of the semifinals. Ohio State is in this tournament. They don't draw real well on a Big Ten campus. We have to get people to go experience the sport, and but it is a growing sport. More and more girls play. More and more girls are finding out there's some college opportunities to play, both at the Big Ten schools and the WCHA schools, and schools in the Wisconsin system. River Falls, Stevens Point, they're good every year. Superior's good every year, and they compete at the Division III level too. So there's an opportunity to get some scholarship and grant money if your girl is an elite player. And I think, like boys have found out, it's a great socialization tool, and you can make teammates that are going to be friends for life. So it's lessons that boys learned long ago. It's a fun sport to play, and I think girls and their parents are learning the same thing now. So it is growing, but it is not inexpensive. So I think that's one of the reasons it hasn't grown more.
I'm kind of a casual hockey fan, not an insider like you. So I'm just kind of curious what your perspective is on college hockey just in general right now. With the current WCHA and Big Ten hockey, and just what's kind of the current landscape of college hockey right now? How are you feeling about it?
That is a good question. I don't think the men's college hockey is very healthy, and I guess you can make the same case for women's college hockey as North Dakota, which is in the middle of hockey country. They draw 11,000 a game in a palatial hockey venue. They dropped the women's sport last March out of the blue. Nobody saw that coming, so it left the WCHA with 7 teams. So and that's not a good number for scheduling, and there's only 38 teams that play women's college hockey. So you'd have to say that sport took a real body blow when North Dakota dropped it last spring, and it's looking for other programs to pick up the mantle. But the men's game, I also think, has been hurt by the reshuffling of the conferences, which was now 4 years ago, when Penn State caused the Big Ten to have a hockey, and it's under its own umbrella. That meant Minnesota and Wisconsin is leaving the WCHA. They're home for years, and Michigan State were leaving the CCHA along with Ohio State. So it prompted a complete reshuffling of all the conferences. And I don't think the fans, I think they've spoken with their wallets and said they don't like that. Crowds are down. There was supposed to be, the new conferences were supposed to provide more television games. That didn't happen. There are games on TV, but they're staged at odd times. I think the Madison area, not too crazy about 8 o'clock hockey on Friday nights. There's been a few games held at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Whereas people had the routines of expecting to see hockey at 7 o'clock on Friday and Saturday back in the glory days of Badger hockey. That ain't the case anymore. Now games are held at different times, but people aren't, there's, with a seven-team league, that means for a lot of non-conference games, and they don't play meaningful hockey games in Madison until December, and most of the games after Christmas in the new Big Ten Conference, and that's tough for the hockey purists to stomach. And certainly the rivalries that Wisconsin had with the North Dakotas and the Denvers and the Colorados and Duluth went away. I mean, those other schools are all competing in the NCHC now. And when there aren't points on the line, when I don't think the games are as meaningful to the fans and probably more importantly to the players. If you aren't playing for points, I think inside your head you aren't playing as hard. But anyway, I think there will be another shuffling of the conferences because I don't think the current edition works. In the WCHA, they're losing a lot of money. It is a geographical diverse conference with two teams in Alaska, one in Huntsville, Alabama, 3 in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, 1 in Bemidji. I'm not a geography major, but that tells me that's a lot of travel for teams that are primarily Division II in every sport but hockey, and they just can't afford to do that. And they've got to come up with some conferences that make sense. And I think you'll see another reshuffling of the deck in the next 2 years. But the Big Ten Conference, I think, is going to remain the Big Ten Conference.
Well, if you were in charge of everything, what would you do to fix college hockey?
I think I'd have to be in charge of a lot of television networks, too. I think television, like it has a lot of sports, has changed things. I mean, the Big Ten Conference formed hockey to give it programming for the Big Ten Network. They, I think, envisioned having a doubleheader on the Big Ten Network and hockey, 2 games on Friday, 1 on Saturday. It'd give them something to fill instead of playing old Michigan, Ohio State football games with Keith Jackson. They need programming. And they thought hockey was part of that answer. As it's turned out, they haven't drawn ratings, and you'll see that the hockey schedule in the Big Ten Network has been diminished to 1 game on Friday night after wrestling. It's not on very often on Saturday. They just hadn't drawn numbers, and to the guys that run the television division of the Big Ten, that's what it's all about. They get a lot of money. The network does. To provide the Big Ten Network. Each school, I believe, this year, between its cut of bowl revenue and money they get from eyeballs on the screen to watch the Big Ten Network, I believe each school in the Big Ten, each of the 14 schools are going to get $50 million. So that buys a lot of socks and jocks. And again, the Big Ten Network needs programming, and hockey's part of that, part of the reason that the network can exist. But anyway, so television is going to dictate a lot of this. And a lot of the promises, or at least suggestions, that were made when they went to new conferences didn't pan out. None of the teams outside the Big Ten get any revenue for their television contracts. I mean, the NCHC has 8 teams, 7 of which are very, very strong, but they don't get any money off their contract with CBS Sports. In fact, you probably didn't even know CBS Sports Network carries the NCHC, but they do. But the schools in that conference don't receive any TV money. And the WCHA has about 4 games on television each year. They get no money off the new look. So anyway, if I ran the league, I'd have a real good relationship with television executives and try to raise some money to get my sport on TV. And I'd try to figure out a way to get the Big Ten teams back. I mean, that conference is going to always exist. But, there are people smarter than me that had a thought that Minnesota and Wisconsin could still have competed in the WCHA in a scheduling interlocking type thing where you'd play all the WCHA teams, yet still have the Big Ten Conference and keep the standings. That's kind of like they did in the Bob Johnson days back in the late 70s. They still have banners hanging at the Kohl Center from Big Ten Conference championships. I think there was a way to bring that back, but let me quickly add, I don't think that's going to happen. I really don't. I think the West, though, is going to have another shuffling of the deck, and there's a thought. I don't know if that's going to work out, but something to look for in the next couple of years.
And I'm kind of curious, how are you feeling about I don't know how much you watch them, but how are you feeling about the Wisconsin Badger program right now with Granato?
They're a lot more fun to watch. I mean, I like Tony's puck possession style where he lets the horses run and, encourages his players to be creative. They're more offensive oriented, but they didn't get any goaltending this year. And while they certainly overachieved last year and almost made the NCAA tournament, the expectations were a lot higher this year. They didn't get the goaltending, in particular the one kid who came in as a second-team All-American from the ECAC. He just didn't pan out. And they lost a lot of games like the Mercyhurst and St. Lawrence at home that good teams just can't lose. I mean, St. Lawrence, one of the worst teams in the land, according to the computer rankings, and you can't lose to them at home. So they didn't get any goaltending. I think that really affected the team's psyche. Not only did the goaltenders didn't win any games, but they also put them in a hole, gave up some bad goals that psychologically, I think, hurt. And they got into a funk they never came out of. And they're not playing very well down the stretch at all. So you got to say, if they overachieved last year, they underachieved this year. But as I said earlier, it all comes down to players. If you recruit well, you're going to do well. And Tony Granato and Marco Sicchi and Mark Strobel are very well respected in the hockey community. This is a world-class school they're recruiting to with big-time facilities at the Kohl Center and in the weight room and at the training table. It's a good school to recruit to. They know the guys. They're going to bring in good players, even though the ones on their list or future top or high draft choices in the NHL, they're going to be good and better than they were this year.
This might be a better question for Tony, but do you think he has any of like Jeff Sauer's coaching mentality in him?
Yeah, I see a lot of them in Tony and Jeff. I mean, I told him that personally. He was really he couldn't have been more supportive after Jeff died last February on a human level. I mean, the family kind of was the liaison between the family and a lot of those initiatives that the public did. And again, Tony was so kind and compassionate and understanding and did so many things that I'm very impressed. But just the way he conducts himself, I mean, we did about a dozen games on television this year, so I was around the program quite a bit. And to see Tony's work, he's brought in a lot of the patients at the Children's Hospital suffering from cancer and had them down. I mean, as open as his locker room is to kids like that, it's pretty amazing to see him in there 10 and 15 minutes before the game and to have the players interact with those patients. And he brings kids to practice, and he's just a wonderful guy. I mean, and he doesn't do it so that people like me or talk about it or the stories get written about it. He is a compassionate individual that understands there's more to life than having a good power play. He gets it, and I mean, he has told me he learned a lot of those things from Jeff. He and Jeff were really tight. I mean, that was probably Jeff's first big recruit. Tony was playing at a prep school in upper state New York, and he brought him in, and Mike Richter, the Hall of Fame goaltender, later came from that school. So Jeff and Tony had a special relationship. The Sauer and the Granato family were really tight. I mean, Robbie and Donnie Granato, Tony's brothers, played here, and Kevin Granato is a cousin who played here. And Cammy Granato is a good friend of Jeff's. I mean, the Granato family were real tight with Jeff, and I really think I really do see a lot of things in Coach Sauer and Coach Granato. And as far as X's and O's, I mean, Tony's just a good coach, a smart guy. I mean, he's been around as long as he played in the NHL. He learned a lot of things, but he's as good a coach as he is, and I think he's a darn good one. He's a better person, just as a lot of people say about Coach Sauer.
I thought I'd close by asking you if you have a favorite story about Jeff that you would like to share.
Well, I don't know. I mean, he could tell stories. He was the one that was. I mean, I look back. I said this the other night to somebody. You know, we gave away the first Jeff Sauer Award. I guess I should talk about that. We're trying to talk about his legacy and the humanitarian type efforts he did. So we established the Jeff Sauer Award and to encourage community service among high school players in the state. We had 4 finalists, 2 boys, 2 girls, 2 juniors, 2 seniors from 4 parts of the state. And, I mean, they were great kids. The winner, Shane Ryan of Edgewood High School, he raised $10,000 in a fundraiser at the West Side Little League because he was always happy when he went to the West Side Little League fields. And he wanted to share that, so he raised the money so he could buy equipment for kids on the West Side that can't afford gloves or bats or balls or uniforms or whatever. And he was our winner, but we had other people. Bailey Johnson, a girl plays for Black River Falls. She went out and raised all sorts of food for, Food Fight, Feed the Hungry project in Neillsville, Wisconsin, where she lives. She's going to volunteer this summer for hurricane victims in Houston, and she works at her church. She coaches in youth softball and hockey in the Black River Falls area. I mean, really doing cool things. Maddie Gibson works at some cancer fundraisers at the Bellin Run in the Green Bay area. She played for the Ice Bears. She worked at a bike-a-thon to raise money for cancer. And kid from Brookfield, a goaltender named Russell Albee, who's has got an Eagle Scout project as part of that gig. He raised over 1,000 household items for senior citizens in the Milwaukee area. He got his team involved. They raised got 200 household items. So kids are doing great things, and we just wanted to recognize that. I've got to tell you, I had no idea that we'd get the response we did. We just started this up and tried to establish it. We got a great response. We got to tell the stories of those kids, and I know the Sauer family was thrilled that Shane Ryan won. Good kid. Anyway, we did that where the Sauer Foundation also is going to underwrite the sled hockey championships, the Midwest Disabled Sled Hockey Festival. That'll be at Madison Ice Arena in 3 weeks. We're given quite a bit of money to underwrite that. There's teams from Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota that'll compete there, and it'll be a big deal for those kids to get to play at a facility where the U.S. Paralympic team train. And we're going to give out, as Shane Ryan does for families that can't afford equipment in baseball, we're going to do the same thing beginning next fall in hockey. That's what we're here for. And we're looking for other initiatives as well. So that's what the Coach Sauer Foundation's about. But then in answer to your question, he was a joy to be around. I don't know one story, but it's like I said to she and Ryan the other night, we're hearing all these stories about how Jeff's like Mother Teresa, and he was a great guy, and he was kind and compassionate, and he really had time for everybody, whether it was a Zamboni driver or a skinny hockey writer in Duluth or a fan that just came up to talk. He had time for everybody. But as good a guy as he was a good guy, too. I mean, it's like I said to Shane, I said, he's this iconic figure now because we're naming awards after him, but he was a guy who was fun to be around. He could tell stories like nobody's business. He'd been to Russia and all over Europe coaching U.S. teams. Again, he'd been in the game for 30 years, and he had stories, and he loved telling them, and he was just a joy to be around, eating pizza, drinking beer with, and that's how I'll remember Jeff, not just for one anecdote. He was just a lot of fun to be around, a darn good hockey coach and a heck of a guy.
For people who want to help out what you're doing with the foundation, how can they get involved or donate, or what would you suggest people who want to help?
Well, we do have a website like everybody else, CoachSauerFoundation.org. You can go there and find out what we're about. We're going to have, again, we had the kickoff dinner at Blackhawk Country Club in the fall. I think we're going to do something a little different, make it more open to the public. We haven't finalized that, but I do know I was in Chicago last week with the sled hockey team. They were nice enough to invite me down to talk to them about Jeff before they left. And they're volunteered to come back. Hopefully they'll come back with gold medals. So we're going to have them back in Madison next fall, and we'll get the public more involved. They're going to play at least a scrimmage, and I think we might even have an opportunity to let everybody find out what sled hockey is about. I think we're going to bring in some sleds and let you play games. But again, we hope to be gold medal winners. So, but we'll have an initiative in the fall we'll get more and more people involved with the Coach Sauer Foundation. But they like to donate. Again, they can go to the website, CoachSauerFoundation.org, where all the information of what we're trying to do is about.
Can I ask, since I'm a big fan of watching the Paralympics sled hockey, what was your message to the guys?
Well, I mean, it was hardly an inspirational message. I pretty much just told stories. I mean, a lot of those guys still played for Jeff. In fact, NBC during the Olympics did a vignette talking about his impact on the team. And they've said the Josh Pauls, the captain, Steve Cash, the goaltender, they've said they've dedicated this to Jeff, and they've got a slogan that's all about team in the locker room. They've got a Coach JS sign that they hit going out on the ice. So he's very much in their hearts. And we just told stories. They just, like you just were asking, they wanted to know what made him tick. And so a lot of the things we discussed about here, I just talked about with those guys.
And one question I had, the name of the foundation, it's called the Coach Sauer Foundation versus the Jeff Sauer Foundation. Is there any particular reason behind that?
Well, I think we threw around some things, and I think the general consensus was, not from the family, from the others, is everybody called him Coach. So, you talk to referees, it's Coach Sauer. You talk to former players, it was Coach Sauer. I mean, they had some other names for him as players probably too, in addition to Sowie, which was his nickname behind his back. But I think everybody, out of respect and deference to him, it's Coach Sauer. I mean, he's Jeff to me, but and traveling with him, even now, a year after he died, people still talk about Coach Sauer, and it did seem natural. And so we went with to most people, he was a coach and mentor, and so it went with the Coach Sauer Foundation.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. That was cool to hear some inside information that I didn't really know him and never got to meet him, but certainly an interesting figure in Wisconsin history.
Well, good guy, great man, really, and certainly no better ambassador ever for the sport of college hockey. I appreciate you letting me have the opportunity to do it.
Bill Brophy, fun guy to talk to. I feel like there's a few more stories that we'll have to pull out of him at some point. If you're wondering, I have no relation to Jeff Sauer that I'm aware of. Thanks for listening to the show. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. You can stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at wispodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.